You want an avoidant to apologize. You want them to finally see what they did, how it hurt, how it confused, how it made you question your worth. Okay, here's the hard truth. You're not going to get there by chasing, by pleading, by trying to be more lovable. That's exactly what keeps avoidant people avoiding. They don't do pressure, they don't do emotional intensity, and they definitely don't do accountability when they feel cornered. But here's what actually works: distance, clarity, and a calm, unapologetic boundary. Not anger, not revenge, just this: hey, what happened between us really hurt me. I needed honesty and presence, and instead I got silence. That doesn't work for me anymore. And then you back off. No follow-up texts, no explaining your pain for the fifth time, no subtle social media posts hoping they'll feel bad. You walk, not in rage, but in power. Avoidants start to reflect only when the emotional fog clears. When you're no longer in their inbox, no longer making it easy for them to dismiss your feelings, and when they start feeling your absence, not your desperation, that's when the door opens, that's when regret creeps in. That's when they finally say the words you've been waiting for: I'm sorry. But here's the kicker: you don't do this to get an apology. You do it to heal, because your peace, your power, and your self-respect, they are not up for negotiation. Let the apology be a bonus. Let you be the victory. Avoidants don't respond well to emotional pressure or chasing. It doesn't matter how heartfelt your message is. It doesn't matter how much pain you pour into your words. If they feel cornered, criticized, or emotionally overwhelmed, they shut down, not because they don't care, but because their nervous system interprets emotional closeness as danger. So the more you chase, the faster they retreat. The more you try to explain your hurt, hoping they'll finally understand, the more they feel like they're failing. And instead of fixing it, they disconnect. When you cry, they get quiet. When you ask them to talk, they say they need space. And when you press harder, text more, call more, demand answers, they either ghost you or they offer short, cold replies that feel more wounding than silence. Here's what's really happening. Avoidants aren't avoiding you. They're avoiding the feelings they don't know how to deal with, yours and their own. They grew up in environments where vulnerability wasn't safe, where needs were ignored or punished. So now, as adults, when they're faced with strong emotion, it sets off alarm bells in their mind. They think, if I engage, I'll lose control. If I get close, I'll get hurt. If I admit I messed up, they'll never forgive me. And so they protect themselves by pulling away. The problem is, when you try harder in that moment, you confirm their fears, you overwhelm them, even if your intention is just to reconnect. You think you're bringing closeness. They feel you're bringing chaos. That's why emotional pressure doesn't work. It's not about your tone or the words you use. It's about the energy of urgency they pick up on, and urgency is their trigger. You want them to take accountability. You want them to say, I'm sorry I hurt you. But the harder you push for it, the more they push you away, not because they're cruel, not because they don't feel guilt, but because avoidance is their armor, and pressure cracks it too fast. So if you really want them to hear you, if you want a moment of real reflection to happen, it won't come through chasing, it'll come through calm clarity. It'll come through saying your truth once, and then stepping back, because avoidants don't respond to pressure, they respond to space, and they reflect when the emotional noise is gone. You want an avoidant to apologize. You want them to finally see what they did, how it hurt, how it confused, how it made you question your worth. Okay, here's the hard truth. You're not going to get there by chasing, by pleading, by trying to be more lovable. That's exactly what keeps avoidant people avoiding. They don't do pressure, they don't do emotional intensity, and they definitely don't do accountability when they feel cornered. But here's what actually works: distance, clarity, and a calm, unapologetic boundary. Not anger, not revenge, just this: hey, what happened between us really hurt me. I needed honesty and presence, and instead I got silence. That doesn't work for me anymore. And then you back off. No follow-up texts, no explaining your pain for the fifth time, no subtle social media posts hoping they'll feel bad. You walk, not in rage, but in power. Avoidants start to reflect only when the emotional fog clears. When you're no longer in their inbox, no longer making it easy for them to dismiss your feelings. And when they start feeling your absence, not your desperation, that's when the door opens. That's when regret creeps in. That's when they finally say the words you've been waiting for. I'm sorry, but here's the kicker. You don't do this to get an apology. You do it to heal because your peace, your power, and your self-respect, they are not up for negotiation. Let the apology be a bonus. Let you be the victory. Stop explaining your pain repeatedly. It dilutes your message. The first time you speak your truth, it holds power. It's raw, it's honest, and it's clear. But the second time, the third time, the 10th, it starts to sound like pleading. It starts to sound like you're trying to convince someone to care, and that's not your job. Your job is to honor your pain by expressing it once, clearly, calmly, and directly. Then you let it land. What they do with it is on them. You don't need to repackage it to make it easier to digest. You don't need to find better words, softer words, more dramatic words. Because the truth is, if someone can't hear you the first time, it's not that you're saying it wrong. It's that they're not ready or willing to listen, and every time you re-explain, you slowly start to abandon yourself. You step out of your power and into performance. You think if you just say it the right way, they'll get it, they'll wake up, they'll finally care. But people don't change because you repeat your pain. They change because they feel the weight of it on their own. Silence speaks louder than repetition. Distance echoes longer than begging. And when someone realizes you're done explaining, that's when they start paying attention. That's when your message finally hits, because now you're not just saying you're hurt, you're showing it. You're not just talking about boundaries, you're living them, and that's where your power lies. Not in over-explaining, not in justifying your feelings, but in knowing that the truth doesn't need to be rehearsed. It doesn't need to be decorated, it just needs to be spoken. Once, with conviction, then you let go. Let go of how they receive it. Let go of whether they respond the way you want. Let go of the urge to chase closure with words they refuse to give. Because real closure comes when you decide your pain deserves more than repetition. It deserves respect, it deserves peace, and it deserves to be spoken once, and honored, not negotiated. Set a clear, calm boundary and communicate your hurt directly, not with anger, not with silence that pretends to be strength, and not with vague signals that leave them guessing. Say what hurt you. Say what you need, and say it like someone who knows they deserve to be heard. Not like someone begging to be chosen, because clarity is powerful. It doesn't need volume, it doesn't need drama, it just needs honesty delivered with composure. Avoidants especially don't respond well to emotional explosions, but that doesn't mean you shrink yourself or suppress what you feel. It means you bring your truth in a way that can actually be received. Not to manipulate, not to guilt trip, but to protect your peace. When you set a boundary, you are not punishing anyone. You are simply saying, this is where I end, and this is where I refuse to be crossed again. That kind of boundary doesn't come from fear. It comes from self-respect. So you speak calmly. You say, that behavior hurt me. You say, I don't feel safe when communication disappears. You say, if that continues, I will step back, not to punish you, but to protect myself. And then you follow through. You don't argue about your boundary. You don't beg them to agree with it. You don't try to prove how valid your hurt is, because if they care, they will listen. If they're capable of growth, they will reflect. But none of that happens unless you get clear first, clear with them and clear with yourself. A boundary is not about changing the other person. It's about showing up for you. And doing it with calm confidence is what makes the difference. Because calm doesn't mean you're okay with what happened. It means you're grounded in your worth even when they don't acknowledge it. When you're clear and calm, your words land deeper. Your energy says, I've thought this through. It says, this isn't a game. And that's what gives your boundary weight. That's what makes them pause, not because you're yelling, but because you're no longer bending. And if they respect you, they'll adjust. If they don't, they won't. But either way, you're no longer waiting to be treated right. You're deciding to be. Step back after expressing your truth. No need to overjustify. Say what you feel. Say what crossed the line. Say what you need moving forward. And then stop. No repeating yourself. No writing 3 more paragraphs to explain why it matters. No editing your truth to make it more palatable for someone who may not even be listening. The moment you start over-justifying, you shift out of self-respect and into self-doubt. You start looking for their validation instead of standing in your own clarity, and that's when your truth loses its power. You're not here to convince someone to understand you. You're here to be honest about where you stand. That alone is enough. If someone values you, your first explanation is all they need. If they don't, then no amount of explaining will ever reach them. Over-justifying isn't communication. It's fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being dismissed. Fear of being abandoned after finally speaking your truth. But here's what you need to remember. You don't need to prove your pain. You don't need to defend your boundaries. You don't need to rehearse your worth for someone who doesn't recognize it. When you express your truth, let it be enough. Let it hang in the air. Let it make them think. Let it create the silence that forces them to sit with what you said. People grow when they have space to reflect, not when they feel pressured to respond instantly. When you step back, you give them that space. You allow the message to sink in without noise, without tension, without expectation. And you give yourself something even more important, peace, because stepping back isn't walking away in defeat. It's standing tall in your power. It says, I've said what I needed to say, and now the rest is up to you. It says, I'm no longer chasing understanding from someone who should already care. And it says, I value myself enough to stop pleading for basic respect. You don't need to keep explaining. You don't need to soften the edges of your experience. You just need to trust that truth, once spoken, doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. It just needs to be honored. First by you. Distance gives avoidants the space they need to reflect and feel, not because they don't care, not because they're incapable of emotion, but because closeness often overwhelms them. Emotional intensity can feel like drowning to someone who's spent a lifetime avoiding vulnerability. So when you pull away, not out of punishment but out of peace, you create a quiet that they can actually hear. A silence that doesn't scream, a pause that doesn't chase, and in that pause, something shifts. The pressure is gone, their defenses lower. They're no longer bracing for another conversation, another confrontation, another wave of emotion they don't know how to process. They have space, and in that space, the truth starts to echo. They remember what you said. They feel the absence of your presence. They sit with the discomfort they once tried to escape. And slowly they begin to feel, really feel, not just react, not just shut down. They reflect on their behavior, on the consequences, on how they handled your hurt. And it happens in a way that chasing never could have accomplished, because avoidants don't wake up when you shout. They wake up when the noise stops. They wake up when the emotional fog clears, and they realize you're no longer standing there, waiting to be chosen. That's when they start to miss you. That's when they feel the weight of your silence. Not the cold kind, but the kind that says, I'm done waiting for you to care. Distance is where accountability begins for the avoidant. It's not about ignoring them. It's not about being cold or strategic. It's about stepping back so they can step inward, because as long as you're in their face, trying to connect, trying to repair, trying to make sense of what went wrong, they don't have to do anything. They just deflect, withdraw, defend, but the moment you stop trying, the moment you leave them alone with their choices, that's when they start to confront themselves. That's when real reflection starts. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped forcing anything. Distance isn't a game, it's a gift of silence, space, and stillness. And for the avoidant, that's where the healing begins. So if you've spoken your truth, if you've set the boundary, if you've stepped back with grace, you've done your part. You don't need to fix them. You don't need to chase clarity. And you certainly don't need to wait around for an apology just to feel whole again. Let them face themselves. Let the silence speak. Let your distance do the talking, because at the end of the day, healing doesn't come when they say sorry. It comes when you stop needing them to, and that is your real power.